Daniel Freeman found his birth certificate and everything became a lie. Under father, a name that belonged to the nation, not to him. 28 years of foster homes, of wondering why no one came, of being told he was nobody's son. All of it built on a secret someone else chose to keep. The current president of the United States had a signature where a father should have been. And Daniel, holding that paper in his shaking hands, realized he hadn't been abandoned by chance. He'd been erased on purpose. Now, standing at the edge of revelation, he faces a choice. Accept money to remain invisible, or demand the one thing no amount of power can suppress, the truth that was stolen from him before he could speak his own name. The storage unit smelled like cardboard and regret. Decades of compressed air, thick with the scent of things people meant to keep, but never loved enough to hold close. Daniel Freeman stood in the doorway, surveying the crumbling boxes stacked against cinder-block walls, each one sealed with tape that had yellowed and peeled at the edges. This was the inheritance of his last foster mother, Mrs. Brennan, who had passed 3 months ago and left him nothing but keys to a rusted padlock and a voicemail, apologizing for not being more. He hadn't expected treasure, hadn't expected anything really, but something about the way she'd said, "There are things you should know," in that final message kept circling his mind like a moth around a bulb that wouldn't go dark. So here he was, 28 years old, standing in a 10 by 10 concrete box in southeast DC, pulling apart the archaeology of a woman who had cared for him between the ages of 9 and 12, before the system moved him again. The first few boxes held what he expected: outdated tax documents, bundles of Christmas cards from people whose handwriting had gone shaky with age, a collection of ceramic angels that Mrs. Brennan must have thought would protect something. Daniel moved through them with the detached efficiency of someone used to packing and unpacking lives, his hands methodical, his mind elsewhere. He'd learned early not to get sentimental about objects. In foster care, everything was temporary, even the bed you slept in. But when he reached the box in the back corner, the one shoved behind a broken lamp and a bag of moth-eaten quilts, something shifted in his chest. The box was smaller than the others, secured with packing tape that looked newer, more deliberate. His name was written across the top, in Mrs. Brennan's careful cursive, "Daniel, when you're ready." He stared at those words for a long time, his fingers hovering over the tape, suddenly afraid of what readiness might actually mean. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crinkled like dried leaves, he found a manila envelope with his name typed on a label, official and impersonal. His hands trembled as he pulled out the document inside, and for a moment he couldn't process what he was seeing. It was a birth certificate, his birth certificate, but not the short-form copy he'd carried in his wallet for years, the one that listed his mother's name and left the father's line blank, a dash that had defined his entire existence. This was different. This was a long-form certificate, embossed with the seal of the District of Columbia, dated 28 years and 7 months ago. His mother's name was there, Catherine Marie Freeman, age 19, occupation listed as student, but it was the line beneath that made the air leave his lungs in a sound he didn't recognize as his own voice. Under father, typed in the same bureaucratic font as everything else, was a name he knew, a name everyone in America knew, William James Harding, the current President of the United States. Daniel's vision blurred at the edges, the concrete walls of the storage unit seeming to tilt and recede. He read the name again, convinced he'd misread it, that his mind was playing some cruel trick born of exhaustion or desperation. But the letters didn't change. William James Harding, age 24, occupation, law student. The date aligned perfectly. It would have been during Harding's final year at Georgetown, before he became a prosecutor, before he entered politics, before he became the man whose face appeared on every screen and newspaper, whose voice addressed the nation, whose life was documented and scrutinized and mythologized. And according to this piece of paper, that man, That carefully constructed, endlessly photographed man was his father, Daniel's father, the father who had never come, never called, never sent so much as a birthday card in 28 years. The father who had let him grow up in a system that shuffled him between strangers, who had watched him disappear into bureaucracy while building a career on promises of family values and protecting the vulnerable. He sat down hard on a box that crunched beneath his weight, the birth certificate still clutched in his hands, and tried to breathe through the sensation of his entire history, rewriting itself in real time. Every question he'd ever asked about where he came from, every night he'd lain awake wondering what was wrong with him that made him unworthy of being claimed. All of it suddenly had an answer, and the answer was worse than abandonment. The answer was choice. Someone had known, someone had decided, and that someone was now the most powerful person in the country, protected by Secret Service and spin doctors and layers of carefully managed mythology. Daniel thought of his mother, Catherine, who had died when he was 3, too young for him to remember her face, too young to ask her why. He thought of the foster homes, the caseworkers who'd looked at him with pity, the forms that always had that blank line where a father should be. And he thought of William Harding, shaking hands and kissing babies, and talking about the importance of taking responsibility, and something cold and hard settled in Daniel's chest. Something that felt like purpose crystallizing from years of shapeless anger. He didn't know how long he sat there, the document trembling in his grip, before he finally stood and walked out of the storage unit, locking it behind him with hands that no longer shook. The afternoon light was harsh and unforgiving, the kind of brightness that made everything look washed out and temporary. But Daniel moved through it with a new certainty. He'd spent his entire life being erased, being the boy with no story, no roots, no name that carried weight. But now he had proof, official, embossed, undeniable proof, that he was someone's son, that he had come from somewhere, that there was a reason for the absence that had shaped him. And the man responsible for that absence was about to discover what it meant when the forgotten refused to stay buried. Daniel pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the search bar, and typed the words he never thought he'd need. DNA test lawyer, Washington, D.C. The results populated instantly, a list of firms specializing in paternity cases, and Daniel felt something that might have been a smile pulling at the corners of his mouth, though it carried no warmth, only the sharp edge of a decision made. He was done being invisible. He was done being the blank space in someone else's narrative. It was time to tell the truth, even if the truth burned everything down. The law office of Patricia Chen occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades, its elevator groaning with mechanical exhaustion as it carried Daniel upward. He'd chosen her firm after reading reviews that praised her tenacity and discretion, qualities that seemed essential when the case involved accusing the President of the United States of fathering a secret child. The receptionist, a young woman with pink-streaked hair and an expression of practiced boredom, had barely looked up when he'd made his appointment, and Daniel wondered if she'd be so casual if she knew what he carried in the envelope pressed against his chest. Now, sitting in Patricia Chen's office, surrounded by diplomas and photographs of her shaking hands with local politicians, he felt the full weight of what he was about to set in motion. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about power and secrets, about the machinery of reputation and the lengths people would go to protect it. And he was walking directly into that machinery with nothing but a piece of paper and a lifetime of absence as his weapons. Patricia Chen was smaller than he'd expected, her frame compact and precise, her dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested efficiency over style. She sat across from him, her expression unreadable as she examined the birth certificate he'd slid across her desk, her fingers tracing the embossed seal as if testing its authenticity through touch alone. Daniel watched her eyes move across the document. lingering on the name that had kept him awake for 3 nights straight, and he tried to read her reaction, but she gave him nothing. Finally, she set the certificate down, folded her hands on the desk, and looked at him with the kind of directness that made him feel simultaneously validated and exposed. "Mr. Freeman," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd spent years arguing in courtrooms, "do you understand what you're asking me to do?" It wasn't a dismissal, but it was a warning, and Daniel appreciated her for not pretending this would be simple or safe. He met her gaze and nodded, his jaw tight. "I want a DNA test," he said. "I want proof, and I want him to acknowledge it." She leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly, and studied him with an intensity that made him feel like she was cataloguing every micro-expression, every hesitation. "This isn't a typical paternity case," she said slowly. "The president has resources, legal teams, crisis managers, people whose entire job is to make problems disappear. If we pursue this, they will investigate every aspect of your life. They will look for anything they can use to discredit you, to paint you as opportunistic or unstable. They will make this ugly, Daniel. Are you prepared for that?" He thought about the foster homes, about sleeping in rooms that smelled like other people's lives, about being moved without warning because a caseworker decided a different placement would be more suitable. He thought about every time someone had looked at him and seen a file number instead of a person, a problem to be managed, rather than a child who needed something as simple as consistency. And he thought about William Harding, who had gone on to build a family, a career, a legacy, while Daniel's entire existence had been reduced to bureaucratic oversight and the occasional kindness of strangers. "I've been invisible my whole life," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his throat. "I've been erased, dismissed, and shuffled around like I didn't matter, and the person responsible for that is now the president, telling everyone how much he values family, how important it is to protect children. I'm not doing this for money. I'm not doing this for attention. I'm doing this because I deserve to exist in my own story, not as a blank space, not as something shameful that had to be hidden. So yes, I'm prepared. Because I've already lived through the worst thing he could do to me. He already pretended I didn't exist. Whatever comes next can't be worse than that." Patricia Chen held his gaze for a long moment, and then something shifted in her expression, a flicker of what might have been respect or recognition. She picked up a pen, pulled a legal pad toward her, and began writing. "Then let's get started," she said. "First, we'll need to file a motion to compel DNA testing. It's going to be an uphill battle. Presidential privilege, executive immunity, they'll throw everything at us. But that birth certificate is strong evidence, and if we can demonstrate a legitimate basis for the claim, a judge might order it." Over the next hour, Patricia laid out the strategy with the precision of someone who'd fought and won battles others considered unwinnable. They would start with a formal request, sent through official channels, giving the president's legal team the opportunity to comply voluntarily, though neither of them believed that would happen. Then they would file in district court, making the case that Daniel had a constitutional right to know his parentage, that the birth certificate constituted prima facie evidence, and that the president, despite his office, was not above the law when it came to matters of personal responsibility. She explained the timeline, the likely responses, the media implications once the story inevitably broke. Daniel listened, his mind cataloguing every detail, every potential obstacle, and felt something settling in his chest that he hadn't felt in years: purpose. For so long, his life had been defined by things that happened to him, decisions made by others, circumstances beyond his control. But this was his choice, his action, his refusal to remain erased. He was 28 years old, and for the first time, he was demanding to be seen. As the meeting ended and Daniel stood to leave, Patricia walked him to the door, her expression serious but not unkind. "One more thing," she said, her hand on the doorknob. "Once this starts, there's no going back. The moment we file, your life changes. People will have opinions about you, about your motives, about whether you deserve this. Are you sure you're ready?" Daniel thought about the storage unit, about Mrs. Brennan's final message, about the years of wondering who he was and why no one had wanted him. He thought about the birth certificate, that single piece of paper that proved he wasn't imagined, wasn't a mistake that could be forgotten, but a person with a name and a history, however much someone had tried to bury it. "I've been ready my whole life," he said quietly. "I just didn't know what I was waiting for." Patricia nodded, a small smile touching her lips, and opened the door. As Daniel stepped out into the fluorescent-lit hallway, the envelope containing his birth certificate tucked securely under his arm, he felt the world shifting around him, reality reconfiguring to accommodate a truth that had been hidden for nearly 3 decades. He was Daniel Freeman, and he had a father, and that father was about to learn what it cost to pretend someone didn't exist. The White House received Patricia Chen's formal request on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to the Office of Legal Counsel with all the bureaucratic precision required for such a sensitive matter. Daniel imagined it sitting on someone's desk, the envelope marked with his lawyer's firm name, the contents threatening to unravel carefully maintained narratives. He pictured some junior staffer opening it, reading the first line, and feeling their blood pressure spike as they realized what they were holding. A legal demand for the President of the United States to submit to a DNA test to confirm paternity of a 28-year-old man raised in foster care. Patricia had warned him that the response would take time, that the machinery of power moved slowly and deliberately, especially when protecting its most valuable asset. But Daniel hadn't expected the silence to feel so suffocating. The days stretching into a week without so much as an acknowledgement that the request had been received. He went to work at the non-profit where he managed donor databases, sat through meetings about fundraising strategies, and smiled at colleagues who had no idea that his entire existence was hanging in the balance, waiting for a man in the Oval Office to decide whether he'd be erased again or finally acknowledged. When the response came, it wasn't in the form Patricia had expected. Instead of a formal letter from the president's personal attorney, they received a phone call from someone who identified himself only as a representative of the administration. His voice was smooth and practiced, the kind of tone perfected in expensive law schools and reinforced through years of negotiations where the outcome was never in doubt. He asked Patricia if she and her client might be available for a meeting, somewhere private, to discuss the matter informally and productively. Patricia, to her credit, had immediately pushed back, insisting that any discussion be documented and that Daniel had a right to formal legal proceedings. But the voice on the other end had been persistent, suggesting that perhaps it would be in everyone's best interest, particularly Daniel's, to explore alternatives before involving courts and judges and the inevitable media attention that would follow. When Patricia relayed the conversation to Daniel, her expression was carefully neutral, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed against her desk in a rhythm that spoke of calculations being made and recalculated. "They want to make this go away," she said bluntly, once she'd finished summarizing the call. "They're going to offer you money, probably a substantial amount, in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement and dropping any claim to paternity. They'll frame it as protecting your privacy, protecting you from the scrutiny that would come with pursuing this publicly. But what they really want is your silence." Daniel had known this was coming. Patricia had warned him repeatedly that the first response would be an attempt to buy him off, to turn his existence into just another line item in a crisis management budget. But hearing it stated so plainly, the transactional nature of it laid bare, made something tighten in his chest. They thought he could be purchased, that the erasure of his entire childhood could be compensated with money, as if what he'd lost could be measured in dollars, rather than in the fundamental human need to know where you came from and why you were left behind. He thought about all the times he'd wondered if he was worth anything to anyone, all the nights in foster homes where he'd tried to make himself smaller, quieter, less of an inconvenience, hoping that maybe this time someone would choose to keep him. "I don't want their money," Daniel said, his voice low but steady. "I never wanted money. I want him to admit I exist. I want him to look at me and acknowledge that I'm his son, that I'm not something shameful that had to be hidden, that I mattered enough to deserve the truth." Patricia nodded slowly, her expression softening in a way that made Daniel think she'd heard similar sentiments before, in other cases, from other clients who'd been denied basic acknowledgement. "I know," she said, "and that's why this is going to be harder than a typical paternity suit, because what you're asking for, recognition, validation, a place in the narrative, that's not something they can give you without consequences. The president has built his entire political career on an image of family values, of moral integrity. Admitting that he abandoned a child, that he's been hiding this for nearly 30 years, would undermine everything he's worked to create. So they're going to fight you, Daniel. They're going to offer money first, and when you refuse, they're going to try to destroy your credibility." Daniel felt the weight of that prediction settling over him like a physical burden, but beneath it was something harder, something that had been forged in the crucible of a childhood spent being dismissed and displaced. He'd survived worse than scrutiny. He'd survived being nobody, being nothing, being erased before he was old enough to protest. If they wanted to investigate him, to dig through his past looking for weaknesses, they'd find exactly what he'd told them. A life shaped by absence, by the choices of someone who decided power was more important than responsibility. "Then we refuse the meeting," Daniel said, straightening in his chair. "We file the motion for DNA testing. We do this the right way, through the courts, on the record. If they want to fight, let them fight in public, where everyone can see exactly what they're protecting and what they're willing to do to keep protecting it." Patricia studied him for a long moment, and then she smiled. A genuine smile this time, not the practiced professional version, and reached for her legal pad. "All right," she said, "then let's give them something to fight about." The motion was filed 3 days later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Daniel's phone started ringing with calls from numbers he didn't recognize, journalists who'd somehow gotten wind of the story, their voices eager and intrusive as they peppered him with questions he refused to answer. Patricia had prepared him for this, had coached him on saying no comment until he was sick of the words. But nothing could have prepared him for the feeling of being suddenly, violently visible. His face appeared on news websites, his name trending on social media, strangers dissecting his life and motives with a certainty that came from knowing nothing but feeling entitled to opinions anyway. The coverage split predictably. Some outlets painted him as the opportunist seeking fame and fortune, while others framed him as a victim, demanding justice from a man who'd spent decades evading responsibility. But what struck Daniel most was how quickly his existence became a debate, a topic for pundits and talking heads to argue over, as if he were theoretical rather than real, as if his life were content to be consumed rather than a human experience that had shaped every moment of his 28 years. And through it all, from the White House, there was only silence, official, calculated, and deafening, as the machinery of power calibrated its next move, deciding how best to make the problem of Daniel Freeman disappear. The meeting was arranged for a Thursday evening at a location that felt deliberately theatrical in its discreetness, a private room in a restaurant near Georgetown, the kind of place where politicians conducted business they didn't want recorded, and deals were made over bourbon that cost more than Daniel used to spend on groceries in a month. Patricia had insisted on being present, and Daniel was grateful for her solid presence beside him as they were led through the main dining room, past tables where power brokers leaned close over white tablecloths, their conversations conducted in the low murmur of people accustomed to being listened to. The room they were shown to was small and windowless, dominated by a polished mahogany table that reflected the overhead lighting like dark water. Two men were already seated there, both in expensive suits that hung on their frames with the precision of tailoring that cost more than most people's rent. Neither stood when Daniel and Patricia entered, a deliberate choice that communicated hierarchy and control, and Daniel felt Patricia's hand briefly touch his elbow, a silent message to stay calm, stay focused. The older of the two men introduced himself as Marcus Holloway, senior counsel to the president, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from decades of protecting powerful people from their own mistakes. The younger man, who looked barely 30 and had the hungry eyes of someone still proving himself, was introduced simply as Andrew, no last name offered. Marcus gestured to the chairs across from them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and Daniel sat, his spine straight, his hands folded on the table in a posture that Mrs. Brennan had once taught him was how you showed people you weren't afraid, even when you were terrified. "Mr. Freeman," Marcus began, his tone measured and practiced, "thank you for agreeing to this conversation. I know this situation has been difficult for you, and I want you to know that the President's office takes your concerns seriously." It was a perfect opening, sympathetic but non-committal, acknowledging emotion without accepting responsibility. And Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach as he recognized the technique. These men were professionals at making problems disappear, and he was the problem they'd been sent to solve. Patricia cut in before Daniel could respond, her voice crisp and professional. "Let's be clear about why we're here," she said. "My client has presented compelling evidence of his biological relationship to the president, including a birth certificate with President Harding's name listed as father. We're not here to negotiate whether Daniel deserves answers. He does. We're here because your office requested this meeting before we proceed to court-mandated DNA testing. So if you have something to offer, let's hear it. But if this is another attempt to pressure my client into silence, we're wasting everyone's time." Marcus's smile tightened fractionally, a micro-expression of annoyance quickly suppressed, and he shifted his attention from Daniel to Patricia with the kind of assessment that spoke of recalibration. Andrew, the younger man, opened a leather portfolio and slid a document across the table, the pages bound with a black clip that looked official and final. "We're prepared to make an offer," Marcus said, his tone shifting into something more businesslike. "One that we believe addresses Mr. Freeman's needs while protecting the privacy of all parties involved." Daniel reached for the document, but Patricia's hand was faster, pulling it toward her and scanning the pages with the rapid efficiency of someone trained to spot traps in legal language. Her expression remained neutral, but Daniel saw her jaw tighten, saw the way her fingers gripped the pages a little harder than necessary, and he knew before she spoke that whatever was written there was designed to erase him all over again. "They're offering you $12 million, Patricia said quietly, her eyes still on the document. "Paid out over 10 years in exchange for signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prevent you from ever publicly claiming paternity, speaking about the president or your mother, or taking any action that could be construed as seeking recognition or relationship. You would also be required to submit to a DNA test, the results of which would be sealed and never released publicly, regardless of outcome. Essentially, they want to pay you to pretend this never happened and disappear from the president's life permanently. Daniel felt the words land like physical blows, each condition another layer of erasure, another way of being told he didn't deserve to exist in the story of his own life. $12 million, an amount he couldn't fully conceptualize, more money than he'd ever imagined having, enough to solve every practical problem he'd ever faced. He thought about the studio apartment he rented in a building where the heat worked intermittently, about the student loans from the community college degree he'd barely managed to complete while working full-time, about the way he sometimes had to choose between groceries and the copay for the therapist who helped him process the trauma of a childhood spent being abandoned repeatedly. $12 million could change everything about his circumstances, but it couldn't change the fundamental truth. He would still be nobody's son, still erased, still hidden, just better compensated for his invisibility. He looked up from the document to find Marcus watching him with an expression of practiced patience, the look of someone who'd made countless deals and expected this one to go the same way as all the others. "This is a generous offer, Mr. Freeman," Marcus said, his tone suggesting he was being reasonable, even kind. "Far more than what most paternity settlements involve, even in cases where the father is wealthy but not public. The president wants to ensure you're taken care of, that you have resources to build the life you deserve. But I'm sure you understand that his position is unique. The presidency carries responsibilities that extend beyond personal matters. The stability of the office, the ability to govern effectively, these things can be compromised by personal scandals, no matter how old or how sympathetically the public might view them. What we're offering you is a chance to move forward, to have security and opportunity, without the scrutiny and ugliness that would come with a public battle. Think about what your life could be with these resources. Think about the doors that would open for you." It was a good pitch, Daniel had to admit, appealing to both his practical needs and his supposed desire to avoid pain. But it was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what he actually wanted, what he'd been searching for his entire life in foster homes and cheap apartments, and the faces of strangers on the street, who might, just might, have been family. "I don't want your money," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "I never wanted money. I wanted a father. I wanted someone to care that I existed, to wonder how I was doing, to show up even once in 28 years. What you're offering me is the same thing he's been doing my whole life, paying me to not exist, to make his life easier by erasing mine. But I'm done being erased. I'm done being the problem that needs to be managed or the scandal that needs to be contained. I'm his son. That's not negotiable, and it's not something that can be bought off with money, no matter how much you offer. So you can take your $12 million and your non-disclosure agreement and tell the president what I'm telling you. I'm not going away. I'm not staying quiet. And if he wants to prove I'm not his son, then he can submit to the DNA test and let the truth come out. But I'm not going to be paid to pretend I don't exist anymore." The room went very quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy with calculation and reassessment. Marcus and Andrew exchanged a look, some wordless communication passing between them, and Daniel felt Patricia's hand squeeze his shoulder briefly, a gesture of solidarity, of support, of recognition that he'd just made a choice that would change everything. Andrew closed his portfolio with a sharp snap, and Marcus stood, his expression neutral, but his eyes cold in a way that made Daniel's skin prickle. "That's unfortunate," Marcus said quietly. "I hope you're prepared for what comes next, Mr. Freeman, because the president's legal team will fight this with every resource at their disposal. And when we're done, your life will be public property. Every mistake you've ever made will be examined and questioned, and the sympathy you think you'll receive will evaporate. when people see what this really is. A man trying to extort the president for money and attention. I'd advise you to reconsider while the offer still stands. Daniel stood too, meeting Marcus's gaze without flinching, and felt something hard and certain crystallizing in his chest. "I've already lived through the worst thing he could do to me," Daniel said quietly. "He already decided I didn't matter enough to acknowledge. So whatever you throw at me now, whatever you try to make me into, can't be worse than what he's already done. And when the truth comes out, because it will come out, people will see exactly what you protected and what you were willing to destroy to keep protecting it." He turned and walked toward the door, Patricia following, and didn't look back as Marcus Holloway's face settled into an expression of cold fury. The battle had begun, and Daniel Freeman was no longer invisible. The story broke on a Monday morning, leaked to a major news network by someone inside the legal system who recognized the case for what it was: explosive, historic, and impossible to contain. Daniel woke to his phone vibrating with notifications, dozens of messages and missed calls, flooding his screen faster than he could process them. He sat on the edge of his bed, still wearing the t-shirt he'd slept in, and watched his name trend on social media, watched headlines populate news sites with variations of the same breathless revelation. Man claims president is his father, demands DNA test, and secret son, paternity case rocks White House, and foster child says he has proof president abandoned him. The accompanying photos were a mix of official images of President Harding looking presidential and solemn, and a grainy picture of Daniel that someone had pulled from his work nonprofit's website. The contrast between them stark and deliberate. Power versus obscurity, legitimacy versus desperation. Daniel scrolled through the coverage with a growing sense of unreality, watching strangers dissect his life and motives with the confidence of people who'd never met him, but felt entitled to judgment anyway. Patricia called within the hour, her voice tight with controlled anger, as she explained that someone in the court system must have leaked the filing, probably for money or political advantage, and now they were in a reactive position instead of controlling the narrative. She instructed Daniel not to talk to any reporters, not to respond to any social media comments, not to engage with the story in any way until they'd crafted an official statement. But even as she spoke, Daniel could hear the shift in her voice, the recognition that this was no longer just a legal case. It had become a spectacle, a cultural moment, a story that people would use to confirm whatever they already believed about power, privilege, and who deserved sympathy. He promised to follow her instructions, ended the call, and sat in the silence of his apartment, feeling the weight of visibility crushing down on him like physical pressure. For so long, he'd been invisible, a ghost moving through systems that didn't care enough to remember his face. Now, he was everywhere, and the exposure felt like being flayed. Every layer of protection stripped away until there was nothing left but raw, vulnerable truth. The response from the White House came swiftly and was devastatingly effective. The press secretary held a briefing that afternoon, her expression appropriately serious, as she read from a prepared statement that had clearly been crafted by lawyers and spin doctors working in concert. "The president is aware of these allegations," she said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering unfortunate but necessary news. "While we cannot comment on ongoing legal matters, I can tell you that the president categorically denies any relationship with the individual making these claims. This appears to be an unfortunate case of mistaken identity or misunderstanding, and we are confident that once the facts are examined, these baseless allegations will be dismissed. The president's focus remains on serving the American people and will not be distracted by attempts to create scandal where none exists." It was masterful deflection, sympathetic to Daniel's supposed confusion while simultaneously denying his existence, framing him as either delusional or opportunistic without having to explicitly say so. The statement gave the press permission to question Daniel's credibility while allowing the president to maintain the moral high ground of someone too dignified to engage with false accusations. The effect was immediate and brutal. Within hours, conservative media outlets had picked up the narrative, running segments that portrayed Daniel as a con artist seeking to exploit the president for money and fame. They dug up details from his past: the foster homes, the fact that he'd struggled academically, a minor shoplifting charge from when he was 16 that had been sealed, but somehow became public knowledge anyway. Commentators speculated about his mental health, his motives, his character, constructing a version of Daniel Freeman that bore no resemblance to the actual person, but fit neatly into the story they wanted to tell. Liberal outlets were only marginally more sympathetic, treating him as a curiosity, a human interest story about a man who might be telling the truth or might be delusional. Impossible to know for sure without that DNA test the president was refusing to take. Daniel watched it all unfold with a strange sense of detachment, seeing himself transformed from a person into a symbol, a projection screen for everyone's beliefs about power and victimhood and who deserved to be believed. But not everyone was hostile. Patricia forwarded him articles from journalists who'd started digging into the timeline, cross-referencing President Harding's time at Georgetown with Daniel's birth certificate, interviewing people who'd known Catherine Freeman and confirming that she had indeed been a student there at the same time. One reporter found a photograph from a law school event where a young William Harding could be seen in the background, talking to a woman who matched descriptions of Catherine. Not proof of anything, but suggestive, the kind of detail that made people pause and reconsider their certainty. Advocacy groups for children in foster care issued statements supporting Daniel's right to know his parentage, framing it not as a political issue, but as a fundamental human right that shouldn't be denied, regardless of who the father was. And slowly, gradually, public opinion began to shift. Not universally, but enough that the monolithic wall of dismissal started showing cracks. People who'd grown up in similar circumstances came forward with their own stories of abandonment and erasure, creating a chorus of voices that said, "We see you, we believe you, you deserve answers." Daniel read these messages late at night, sitting in the glow of his laptop screen, and felt something loosening in his chest. The tight knot of isolation that had defined his entire life starting to unravel as he realized he wasn't alone in this fight. The turning point came 2 weeks after the story broke, when a former classmate of Catherine Freeman's agreed to an on-camera interview with a major news network. Her name was Jennifer Caldwell, and she'd been Catherine's roommate during that final year at Georgetown before Catherine dropped out, pregnant and alone. Jennifer spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd spent days deciding whether to come forward, weighing the cost of involvement against the pull of conscience. She described Catherine as kind and naive, a scholarship student from a small town who'd been overwhelmed by the intensity of Georgetown's competitive environment. And she confirmed, with a certainty that made the interviewer lean forward in her chair, that Catherine had been involved with a law student named William Harding, that the relationship had been brief but intense, and that when Catherine discovered she was pregnant, Harding had made it clear he wasn't interested in being a father. She was devastated, Jennifer said, her voice thick with emotion even after nearly 3 decades. She thought he cared about her, thought they had something real, but when she told him about the baby, he changed completely. He said his career was just starting, that he couldn't afford to have this complicate things. He offered her money for an abortion, and when she refused, he just disappeared, stopped returning her calls, avoided her on campus. She was so alone. The interview went viral within hours, Jennifer's testimony adding credibility to Daniel's claim in a way that legal documents couldn't, putting a human face on the abandonment that had shaped his entire existence. The pressure on the White House intensified after Jennifer's interview, with journalists demanding answers and legal experts questioning whether the president could continue to refuse DNA testing in the face of mounting evidence. Patricia filed a motion arguing that the president's categorical denial, combined with his refusal to provide biological samples for testing, constituted an abuse of power and a violation of Daniel's constitutional right to due process. The judge assigned to the case a no-nonsense woman named Sandra Martinez, who had a reputation for refusing to be intimidated by political pressure, scheduled a hearing to consider the motion. And suddenly, the abstract legal question became concrete and urgent. Daniel sat in Patricia's office the day before the hearing, reviewing the strategy, and felt the full weight of what was about to happen settling over him like a physical burden. Tomorrow, he would stand in a courtroom and demand that the President of the United States acknowledge his existence. Tomorrow, the machinery of power would either bend to accommodate truth, or it would find a way to crush him completely. And Daniel, sitting there with his hands folded and his jaw tight, realized that he was no longer afraid of being crushed. He'd spent his whole life being erased, being told implicitly and explicitly that he didn't matter enough to fight for. But he mattered now. His truth mattered. And whatever happened next, he would face it knowing that he'd refused to disappear, that he'd stood up and demanded to be seen, and that was worth more than any amount of money or comfort or safety they could offer him. He was Daniel Freeman, and he existed. And tomorrow the world would have to decide whether that existence deserved acknowledgement or whether power was more important than truth. The courthouse was surrounded by camera crews and protesters. By the time Daniel arrived with Patricia, the steps leading to the entrance transformed into a circus of competing narratives and shouted slogans. On one side, people held signs declaring, "DNA don't lie," and fathers must take responsibility, their faces set with the righteous conviction of those who saw Daniel's case as representative of something larger than one man's search for identity. On the other side, counter-protesters waved flags and held signs reading, "Protect our President," and "Stop the smear campaign," their anger palpable as they screamed accusations of opportunism and political sabotage. Daniel walked between them with his head down, Patricia's hand on his elbow, guiding him forward, and tried not to hear the things they were saying about him, the judgments being hurled from people who knew nothing about who he was or what he'd survived. Security officers cleared a path through the crowd, their faces impassive as they created a corridor of relative safety, and Daniel felt grateful when the courthouse doors finally closed behind him, muffling the noise to a distant roar that still reverberated through the marble floors and high ceilings. Inside, the building hummed with a different kind of energy. Journalists in professional attire clustered in the hallways, legal observers from various advocacy groups checked in with court officials, and lawyers in expensive suits moved with the practiced confidence of people accustomed to high-stakes litigation. Patricia had warned Daniel that the hearing would be crowded, that public interest guaranteed every seat would be filled and overflow would watch from monitors in adjacent rooms, but seeing it made real was overwhelming in a way he hadn't anticipated. This was his life being litigated, his existence being debated, and the audience treating it like entertainment or political theater made something tighten in his chest. He followed Patricia to a small conference room where they could wait before being called, and sat in silence, his hands folded on the table, trying to steady his breathing and remember the coaching she'd given him about staying calm, maintaining dignity, refusing to let emotion undermine the legitimacy of his claim. But it was hard to stay calm when everything he was fought for was about to be decided by strangers in robes who would weigh evidence and precedent without ever having felt what it was like to grow up knowing you'd been deliberately erased. The courtroom itself was smaller than Daniel had imagined, but no less imposing, with dark wood paneling and an elevated bench where Judge Sandra Martinez would preside over the hearing. The gallery filled quickly, journalists claiming front-row seats, while members of the public who'd camped out overnight for a chance to witness history filled in behind them. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table next to Patricia, acutely aware of the eyes on his back. The whispered speculation about whether he was brave or delusional, sympathetic or opportunistic. Across the aisle, the defense table was occupied by a team of 4 lawyers, all representing the president's interests, their collective presence designed to communicate the seriousness with which the White House was taking this threat. Marcus Holloway sat at the center, his expression impassive, flanked by younger associates who shuffled papers and whispered strategies. The disparity in resources was stark. Patricia and Daniel against a legal army funded by taxpayers and political donors, but Patricia had assured him that judges like Martinez didn't care about how many lawyers you brought, only about whether the law was on your side. Judge Martinez entered through a door behind the bench, her black robe swishing as she moved with the efficiency of someone who'd presided over hundreds of cases and had no patience for theatrics. She was in her late 50s, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled back severely, her face composed in an expression that gave nothing away about her thoughts or sympathies. "Be seated," she said as she took her position, and the room obeyed, with a collective rustling of fabric and creaking of benches. She looked down at the documents before her, then up at the assembled lawyers, her gaze sharp and assessing. "We're here on a motion to compel DNA testing in the matter of Freeman versus Harding," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "Before we begin, I want to make something absolutely clear. This is a court of law, not a political arena. I'm not interested in spin, deflection, or attempts to try this case in the media. What I care about is evidence, legal precedent, and whether Mr. Freeman has standing to request what he's requesting. Counsel for the plaintiff, you may proceed." Patricia stood, her movements deliberate and controlled, and approached the podium positioned between the 2 tables. She laid out Daniel's case with the precision of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, presenting the birth certificate as prima facie evidence of paternity, citing legal precedent establishing that individuals have a constitutional right to know their biological parentage, and arguing that the president's categorical denial without submitting to testing violated both Daniel's rights and the fundamental principle that no one, regardless of position, was above the law. She spoke about Daniel's childhood in foster care, about the psychological harm caused by being denied knowledge of one's origins, about the pattern of powerful men using their resources to avoid accountability for their actions. Her voice remained steady throughout, professional and passionate in equal measure, and Daniel felt something swelling in his chest as he listened to his life being translated into legal arguments, his pain being given weight and legitimacy in the formal language of justice. When she finished, Judge Martinez nodded thoughtfully and turned her attention to the defense table. "Mr. Holloway, your response." Marcus Holloway rose with the confidence of someone who defended powerful people from consequences for decades, his expression appropriately serious as he approached the podium. He began by expressing sympathy for Daniel's difficult childhood, a rhetorical move designed to seem compassionate while simultaneously undermining the claim, acknowledging suffering while suggesting it had clouded judgment or created desperation that led to false accusations. He argued that the birth certificate, while authentic, didn't constitute conclusive proof of paternity, that clerical errors occurred, that Catherine Freeman could have been mistaken or deliberately misleading when she provided information to hospital staff. He cited cases where men in positions of power had been falsely accused by individuals seeking financial gain or revenge, creating a pattern that he suggested Daniel's case fit neatly into. And then he played his strongest card: presidential immunity. The president, Holloway argued, couldn't be subjected to civil litigation while in office, particularly for matters that predated his presidency and had no bearing on his official duties. To compel DNA testing would set a dangerous precedent, opening the door for frivolous paternity claims against any sitting president, creating a mechanism for political enemies to harass and distract from governing. It was a powerful argument, one that appealed to concerns about institutional stability and the smooth functioning of government, and Daniel felt his stomach drop as he realized how effective it might be. Judge Martinez listened without interruption, her expression revealing nothing, as Holloway concluded his argument and returned to his seat. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present as the judge reviewed her notes, her pen moving across paper in quick, decisive strokes. Finally, she looked up, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom before settling on the two legal teams. "I've reviewed the submitted materials and heard both arguments," she said, her voice carrying a note of finality that made Daniel's heart race. "This is indeed a complex case, touching on issues of personal rights, executive privilege, and the limits of judicial authority. However, I'm struck by several factors that I believe are determinative. First, Mr. Freeman has presented credible evidence, a birth certificate bearing President Harding's name that establishes at minimum a reasonable basis for his claim. Second, while presidential immunity is real and important, it has never been interpreted to shield presidents from all civil matters, particularly those involving pre-existing personal obligations. And third, Mr. Freeman is not seeking monetary damages or attempting to influence the president's official duties. He is seeking something far more fundamental: confirmation of his biological parentage, a right that has been repeatedly affirmed by courts across this country as essential to human identity and dignity. Therefore, I am granting the motion to compel DNA testing. President Harding will be required to provide a biological sample within 30 days for comparison to Mr. Freeman's DNA. The results will be sealed pending further proceedings, but both parties will have access. This court recognizes the unprecedented nature of this ruling, but I am convinced that the law and basic principles of justice support it. We are adjourned." She struck her gavel once, a sharp crack that echoed through the stunned silence, and then she was gone, leaving behind a courtroom erupting into controlled chaos as journalists scrambled for their phones and Daniel sat frozen, barely able to process what had just happened. Patricia's hand squeezed his shoulder, and when he looked up at her, he saw tears in her eyes, a rare break in her professional composure. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." And Daniel, sitting there as the reality of the judge's decision washed over him, felt something breaking open in his chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but something close to it. Something that felt like the possibility of truth, finally being acknowledged. The 30 days between the court order and the scheduled DNA testing felt simultaneously endless and frighteningly brief, time stretching and compressing in ways that made Daniel feel unmoored from reality. The ruling had generated international headlines, legal scholars debating its implications on news programs, while political commentators argued about whether Judge Martinez had overstepped her authority or courageously upheld the rule of law. The president's legal team filed an emergency appeal, attempting to block the testing pending review by a higher court, but the appellate judges declined to intervene, issuing a terse statement that the matter could be reviewed after testing was completed, if necessary. For Daniel, watching these procedural battles unfold, it felt surreal that something as fundamental as his identity, whether he was or wasn't the biological son of William James Harding, had become a matter of legal strategy and political maneuvering. But beneath the surrealism was a growing certainty, a bone-deep knowledge that the truth was about to become undeniable, that soon there would be no more speculation or denial, only facts rendered in genetic code that couldn't be spun or dismissed. The testing took place on a grey Thursday morning at a medical facility that had been selected for its reputation for absolute confidentiality and scientific rigor. Daniel arrived with Patricia, passing through security checkpoints staffed by federal agents whose presence made the proceedings feel more like a state secret than a paternity test. They were escorted to a private room where a technician explained the process with clinical detachment. A simple cheek swab, quick and painless. The cells then sealed in containers that would be sent to 2 independent laboratories for analysis to ensure accuracy and prevent any accusation of tampering. Daniel sat in the medical chair, opened his mouth when instructed, and felt the swab brush against the inside of his cheek with a softness that seemed incongruous with the magnitude of what it represented. This small sample of his DNA would be compared to the president's, and within days he would know definitively whether the man who'd shaped American policy for the last 3 years was the same man who'd provided half his genetic material and then walked away, leaving Daniel to navigate childhood alone and wondering why he hadn't been worth staying for. The president's sample was collected separately, under conditions even more secure, at the White House medical facility, with witnesses present to maintain chain of custody and prevent any claims of sample switching or contamination. The media covered the event with breathless intensity, cameras positioned outside the White House gates, capturing the moment when the sealed sample was transported by armored vehicle to the testing laboratories. It was theater of the highest order, a visible manifestation of power being held accountable, and public opinion crystallized further around the understanding that if the president had nothing to hide, this level of security and drama wouldn't be necessary. Polls showed the nation divided but increasingly sympathetic to Daniel's position, not because everyone believed his claim, but because the refusal to simply take the test and settle the matter definitively made the president's denial seem desperate rather than dignified. Editorial boards that had initially dismissed Daniel as an opportunist began writing pieces questioning why the president wouldn't just provide the truth and let the matter be resolved. And slowly, inexorably, the narrative shifted from "man makes outrageous claim" to "president refuses to answer legitimate question." The wait for results was the longest 10 days of Daniel's life. He tried to maintain normalcy, going to work at the non-profit where his colleagues treated him with a mixture of awe and uncomfortable fascination, eating meals he couldn't taste, sleeping in fragments interrupted by dreams where he stood before doors that wouldn't open, voices calling his name from rooms he couldn't enter. Patricia checked in daily, her calls a mixture of legal updates and genuine concern for his well-being, and Daniel appreciated her more than he could articulate. She'd become more than his lawyer, something closer to an advocate in the deepest sense, someone who believed not just in his case, but in his fundamental right to exist fully in his own story. He avoided social media, unable to bear the constant speculation and judgment, the think pieces about what it meant if he was right, what it meant if he was wrong, as if either outcome would define something essential about truth and power, and whether ordinary people could challenge those who'd been granted extraordinary positions. When the call finally came, Daniel was sitting in his apartment on a Sunday afternoon, rain streaking down the windows and blurring the city beyond into abstract shapes and muted colors. Patricia's voice was steady, but he could hear the emotion underneath, the weight of what she was about to tell him. "The results are in," she said, and Daniel's heart stopped, the entire world narrowing to her next words. Both laboratories reached identical conclusions. The DNA comparison shows a 97% probability of paternity. Daniel, it's confirmed. President William Harding is your biological father. There's no doubt, no room for interpretation. You were right. You were right all along. Daniel heard the words but couldn't immediately process them, his brain refusing to accept that the question that had haunted his entire existence, who was his father, why had he been abandoned, what was wrong with him that made him unworthy of being claimed, finally had an answer, and the answer was exactly what he'd been saying since he found that birth certificate in Mrs. Brennan's storage unit. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't opportunistic. He wasn't mistaken. He was William Harding's son, biological and undeniable, and for 28 years that fact had been buried and denied and erased because it was inconvenient for a man building a political career on an image of moral integrity. "Daniel, are you there?" Patricia's voice pulled him back, concerned and gentle. "I'm here," he managed, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. "I'm here. What happens now?" Patricia explained the next steps. The results would be unsealed per the court order, the White House would be officially notified, and they would need to decide how to proceed, whether to seek a public acknowledgement, whether to pursue any kind of relationship, or simply let the truth stand on its own as vindication. But as she talked, Daniel found himself thinking not about strategy or next moves, but about his mother, Catherine, who'd died when he was too young to know her, who'd carried the weight of this secret and the pain of being abandoned while pregnant and alone. He thought about all the foster homes, all the social workers, all the moments of wondering who he was and where he came from. The fundamental human need to know your origins that had been denied to him because someone decided their ambitions were more important than his identity. And he thought about William Harding, about to face the consequences of a choice made nearly 3 decades ago, about to learn that the child he'd walked away from had grown into a man who refused to stay erased. "I want to release a statement," Daniel said, interrupting Patricia's explanation of legal protocols. "I want people to know the truth, not because I want to hurt him or destroy his presidency, but because I deserve to exist in the narrative. I deserve to be acknowledged. And maybe other people who've been abandoned, who've been told they don't matter, need to see that the truth can come out, that they weren't wrong to want answers." Patricia was quiet for a moment, and then she said softly, "I'll draft something tonight. We'll release it tomorrow. And Daniel, I'm proud of you. What you've done here, standing up, refusing to be silenced, fighting for your right to exist, it matters. You matter." Daniel hung up the phone and sat in the grey afternoon light, feeling the weight of confirmation settling over him like a physical presence, transforming him from someone making accusations into someone stating documented facts. He was Daniel Freeman, son of Catherine Marie Freeman and William James Harding. The DNA didn't lie. And tomorrow, the world would know that truth, would have to reckon with what it meant that the President of the United States had abandoned his child, had lied about his existence, had tried to pay him to disappear rather than simply acknowledge the most basic fact of their biological connection. Daniel looked out at the rain-blurred city and felt something like peace beginning to take root in his chest, fragile but real. The peace of finally having proof that he'd existed all along, that he'd mattered, that the absence that shaped his life hadn't been his fault, but someone else's choice, a choice that could no longer be denied or hidden or explained away. The statement was released at 9 o'clock Monday morning, time to catch the news cycle as it began and ensure maximum visibility. Patricia had crafted it carefully, balancing Daniel's need to speak his truth with legal precision that couldn't be challenged or misinterpreted. It read, "I am Daniel Freeman, and I am the biological son of President William James Harding. This has been confirmed by independent DNA testing ordered by a court of law and conducted with full chain of custody protocols to ensure accuracy. I did not pursue this case for money, fame, or political advantage. I pursued it because I deserved to know who my father was, and because I refused to remain erased from a story that is fundamentally mine. My mother, Catherine Freeman, carried the burden of this secret until her death, and I have carried the weight of abandonment my entire life. The president had the opportunity to acknowledge the truth privately, to take responsibility for his actions and their consequences. Instead, he chose denial, attempted to pay me to remain silent, and used every legal mechanism available to avoid accountability. I want to be clear. I don't seek to destroy President Harding or undermine his presidency, but I will not pretend I don't exist to protect his reputation. I am here. I have always been here, and every child who has been abandoned or erased deserves to know that their existence matters, regardless of who found it inconvenient. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, every major news outlet was running the story. Anchors reading the DNA results with barely concealed shock, legal analysts confirming the validity of the testing procedures, political commentators scrambling to assess what this meant for the Harding presidency and the upcoming election cycle. The White House initially issued a terse statement acknowledging the test results and stating that the president was reviewing the matter with his family and advisors, a non-response that satisfied no one and only intensified the pressure for a more substantive acknowledgement. But as hours passed and no further statement came, it became clear that the administration was in crisis mode, trying to determine how to respond to a truth that couldn't be spun away but threatened everything the president's carefully constructed image was built upon. Protesters, who had defended the president against Daniel's baseless accusations, found themselves confronted with irrefutable evidence, and many quietly took down their signs and went home, unable to maintain their certainty in the face of scientific proof. Meanwhile, support for Daniel intensified, with advocacy groups, celebrities, and ordinary people sharing stories of abandonment and praising his courage in demanding acknowledgement. Daniel watched the coverage from his apartment, feeling strangely detached from the circus his life had become. He'd done what he set out to do, prove his existence, force the truth into public consciousness, refuse to be erased. But now, sitting in the aftermath of that victory, he found himself grappling with more complicated emotions. He had a father, confirmed and undeniable, but that father was a stranger who'd spent decades pretending he didn't exist, who'd been more concerned with protecting his career than acknowledging his child. The DNA test hadn't given Daniel a relationship. It had only confirmed the absence of one, had proved that the abandonment he'd experienced wasn't accidental, but deliberate. He thought about reaching out, about writing a letter or requesting a meeting, but the idea felt hollow. What would he say to a man who'd had 28 years to care and had chosen not to? What response could possibly heal the wound of being deliberately erased, of being considered less important than political ambitions and public image? The validation he'd fought for was real and important, but it didn't erase the years of foster care, the nights of wondering what was wrong with him, the fundamental loneliness of growing up without roots or connection. 3 days after the DNA results were released, the White House finally issued a comprehensive statement. President Harding appeared on camera, his expression somber and stripped of the usual political polish, standing behind a podium in the Oval Office without notes or prepared remarks. "I want to address directly the matter of Daniel Freeman," he began, his voice measured but noticeably strained. "The DNA test results are accurate. Daniel is my biological son, conceived during a brief relationship when I was in law school. When his mother, Catherine Freeman, told me she was pregnant, I responded in a way that I have come to deeply regret. I was young, focused on my career, and I made a selfish decision to walk away rather than take responsibility for my actions and their consequences. I told myself I wasn't ready to be a father, that supporting her financially was enough, but the truth is, I chose my ambitions over my child, and that choice caused harm that cannot be undone." He paused, and for a moment, something like genuine emotion crossed his face, though whether it was guilt or regret, or simply recognition of political consequences, was impossible to discern. Daniel grew up in foster care, moving between homes, without the stability or support that every child deserves. He grew up wondering about his father, searching for answers that I deliberately withheld. When he found his birth certificate and reached out through legal channels, my first instinct was still to protect myself, to offer money for his silence rather than give him what he actually deserved: acknowledgement, truth, and the basic recognition of his existence. I was wrong. I have been wrong for 28 years. I cannot undo the past or give Daniel back the childhood he deserved, but I can say publicly what I should have said decades ago. Daniel Freeman is my son, and I'm sorry for abandoning him, for denying him, and for trying to erase him even when he courageously demanded to be seen. The speech continued, Harding addressing questions about his political future, acknowledging that his actions deserved consequences, and stating that he would work with advisors and family to determine the appropriate path forward. But Daniel barely heard the rest. His attention caught on those words. Daniel Freeman is my son. It was the acknowledgement he'd fought for, public and unequivocal, the erasure finally undone. He'd expected to feel triumph or vindication, but instead he felt something quieter, something closer to grief. Because while he now had acknowledgement, he didn't have a father, not in any meaningful sense. William Harding had admitted paternity under legal compulsion and public pressure, not because he'd suddenly developed genuine care or desire for relationship. The apology, however sincere it might be, couldn't give Daniel back the years of wondering, couldn't undo the trauma of abandonment, couldn't transform a biological connection into the kind of bond that actually sustained and nurtured. He had won his case, had proven his truth, had forced recognition from one of the most powerful men in the world. But the victory felt hollow in ways he hadn't anticipated, because what he'd really wanted, what every abandoned child wants, wasn't acknowledgement of DNA, but the experience of being chosen, of mattering enough to fight for, of being loved simply because you existed. Patricia called that evening, her voice warm with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "You did it," she said. "He acknowledged you publicly. It's over, Daniel. You won." But Daniel, sitting in his apartment watching the sun set over DC in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of endings rather than beginnings, wasn't sure that winning was the right word for what had happened. He'd gotten the truth, yes, and that mattered. It would always matter that he'd refused to stay erased, that he'd stood up and demanded recognition in a system designed to silence people like him. But he was still alone, still without the family or belonging he'd searched for his entire life. The DNA test hadn't given him a father. It had only confirmed the shape of his abandonment, had put a name and face to the person who'd chosen career over child, ambition over responsibility. "I don't think either of us won," Daniel said quietly. "I think we just finally told the truth, and now we both have to figure out how to live with it." He thanked Patricia for everything she'd done, promised to stay in touch, and ended the call. Then he sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about his mother, Catherine, about Mrs. Brennan, about all the foster parents who'd cared for him with varying degrees of competence and compassion. He thought about the life he'd built, despite the absence, the person he'd become without guidance from the man who should have been there, and he realized that while he'd needed the acknowledgement, had needed the world to know he existed and mattered, his real worth had never depended on William Harding's recognition. He'd survived without it. He'd become a person despite it. And now, sitting in the aftermath of his public victory, Daniel Freeman understood that his identity wasn't defined by his father's acknowledgement or lack thereof. It was defined by his own choices, his own refusal to disappear, his own courage in demanding truth even when powerful people tried to silence him. The weeks that followed brought more changes. President Harding's approval ratings dropped significantly, several advisors resigned, and political opponents began calling for his resignation, arguing that a man who'd abandoned his child and lied about it for decades lacked the character necessary for the presidency. Harding weathered the storm, issuing further apologies and promising to make amends, though what form those amends might take remained unclear. He reached out through intermediaries, asking if Daniel would consider meeting privately, perhaps beginning some form of relationship. Daniel declined, politely but firmly. He didn't want a relationship built on obligation and scandal management. He'd spent his whole life being someone's burden, and he refused to become one again. If William Harding genuinely wanted to know him, to build something real, it would require more than crisis response outreach. It would require sustained effort, genuine care, and the humility to accept that some harm couldn't be undone simply by showing up late. Maybe someday that relationship would be possible, but for now, Daniel needed space to process what had happened, to integrate this new reality into his understanding of himself. He'd gotten what he fought for: truth, acknowledgement, vindication. What he did with that was his choice to make, on his timeline, in ways that honored his own needs rather than anyone else's agenda. 6 months after the DNA results were released, Daniel stood in the storage unit where this entire journey had begun, the space now emptied of Mrs. Brennan's belongings, except for the box that had contained his birth certificate. He'd kept it, along with the document itself, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of where he'd come from, of the truth that had been buried, of his own courage in refusing to stay buried with it. He ran his fingers over the label she'd written: "Daniel, when you're ready." Mrs. Brennan had known, he realized. She'd been one of the few people who'd seen his birth certificate, had understood what it meant, and had kept it safe until he was old enough to decide what to do with the information. She'd given him a choice, and in making that choice, in pursuing the truth, even when it would have been easier to let it stay hidden, Daniel had claimed ownership of his own story. He was no longer defined by absence or abandonment, no longer the boy with the blank line where a father should be. He was Daniel Freeman, son of Catherine and William, raised by a system and a community that had been imperfect, but had ultimately given him the resilience to stand up and demand recognition. He'd wanted a father, had wanted the story to end with reunion and healing, but life rarely gave you the endings you imagined. Instead, it gave you truth and the opportunity to decide what to do with it. Daniel locked the storage unit one final time, handed the keys to the facility manager, and walked out into afternoon sunlight that felt warmer than it had in years. He had his truth now. He had his acknowledgement. And most importantly, he had himself, whole, real, and undeniable. That, he decided, was enough. That was everything. He'd fought to exist in his own story, and he'd won. Everything else was just details, complications to navigate, relationships to build or decline on his own terms. But the fundamental battle, the fight to be seen, to matter, to exist, was over. And Daniel Freeman, standing in the parking lot of a storage facility in Southeast DC, finally felt like he could breathe without the weight of erasure crushing his chest. He was here. He'd always been here. And now, finally, everyone knew it. The truth couldn't be buried anymore, and neither could he.